Welcome everyone to this session of Tea Time Talks with MDRP. Today we're going to be talking about a very interesting topic in the medical devices regulatory space. We are deviating from conventional medical devices that we are familiar with and diving into what we call software as medical device or SaMD. In order to have the discussion, I have with me today an expert speaker who's going to be helping us understand what exactly goes into software as medical device manufacturing and marketing. Today I have with me Andrea, who's joining us all the way from Switzerland. Hi Andrea, let's hear a little bit about your background.
Hello Anushree. Hi. So I will give a very quick introduction about myself. So I'm an electronic and biomedical engineer by training. I did a PhD in brain machine interfaces at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Lausanne. During my PhD, I took care of translating prototypes of brain machine interfaces into clinical research and then startups innovation. I created my own startup starting 2012. It was the conception of the idea until the acquisition of the startup was 2018. In 2017, I joined Confinis. It's a regulatory compliance, regulatory consulting company based in Switzerland, in Canton Lucerne. And now I manage a team as a competence cluster lead and senior consultant. I manage a team of consultants that work on clinical evaluation, so a generic horizontal topic. And clinical evaluation is the process that allows you to claim safety and performance of a device to access the European market. And then I also deal with the topics, vertical topics of digital health and active implantable medical devices.
Amazing. That's like a wide range of experience that you have right there. And I'm sure I couldn't have chosen a better speaker for this particular topic. Thank you so much, Andrea, for being with us today.
You're welcome.
All right. So as always, before we go into the actual discussion about the various questions that we have from our members of the group, a quick understanding of what SaMD really is. So I think to simplify it, we have the International Medical Devices Regulators Forum, the IMDRF, that defines SaMD as software intended to be used for one or more medical purposes that perform these operations without being a part of a hardware medical device. Now, it seems like a very simple definition. However, it gets complex because of these two words, medical purposes. There are a lot of software that are out there in the market which might be used by a clinician, but they do not serve any medical purpose. These software which are not serving a medical purpose do not become software for medical device. Some examples of software as medical device include software that are used for treatment planning or that are used for diagnosing a condition, so diagnostic software, of course. And then there are software that are connected to hardware medical device, but they are not needed by that hardware device to achieve the intended medical purpose. I think it becomes easier when you also think about some software which cannot be called SaMD. Now, these include those software that are used as embedded firmware to monitor the performance of a device. Like if you think about it, there are infusion pumps that are used on patients. So these infusion pumps are medical devices, but the software that is making them function, that software won't qualify as a software as medical device. Similarly, software required by hardware medical device to perform the intended use, these are not going to be classified as SaMD. Then there are software that rely on data from a medical device but do not serve a medical purpose. Like I said, medical purpose becomes very important. These are not SaMD. And finally, software enabling clinical communication or device servicing or providing some sort of input parameters to another SaMD. These are not going to be classified as software as medical device. I would request all listeners to in fact go a little bit deeper into this and read up on what exactly qualifies as software as medical device, because this is a tricky part of medical devices regulatory space. And especially for manufacturers, these software developers, I think it requires a good amount of understanding of what qualifies to be an SAMD before you think about how you want to proceed with its marketing. So, without wasting any more time, I think, Andrea, we have quite a few questions that we need answers to, and that's going to bring about a more holistic approach to our understanding of SEMD. I think starting with one important part, when there is a software developer, there's a manufacturer of an SAMD. We are not just looking at the regulatory aspect, because for SAMD, the quality bit also, the whole development part of it becomes very important. And that's where design controls come into the picture. So I want to understand what type of design controls should be implemented for SAMD as a whole.
Yes, so that's a very good question, and we often get this question from university hospitals, for example, or research centers that may develop some software for a research project. I'm still in the example, and they may want to use it as a medical device. So the answer to this, let's say, whenever we produce medical devices, as you know, we are obliged to, and there is some requirement. There are some requirements to document the design controls, and the traditional design controls come in a V model where you have user requirements, design inputs, the object, and then some verification tests and some validation tests. The verification is how you demonstrate that you built your thing correctly, and the validation is how you demonstrate that you built the correct thing. Now, for software, this V model is a bit more complex, and normally we tend to use a standard. That's the software lifecycle process for medical devices. The standard is called IEC 62304, and this gives a very good guidance on what you need to establish when you want to document software as a medical device, or any type of software approach. Now, what is said in this standard is how you decompose the software depending on the risk it has and what type of deliverables you need to have according to the risk class of the software. I would say that following that standard is good practice, but real life has other issues, such as how do we develop efficiently within the 62304 environment? How do we develop agile within this framework? How do we couple agile to a V model approach? And the answer is not so trivial. So we need to often reason a bit with the development team so that we can use other software platforms to track requirements, risks that are related to the requirements, and verification validation tests. But ultimately, let's say that whoever develops in this regulated environment needs to reason with a V model in mind. So having clear step-by-step deliverables that can be updated in the future, also during iterative agile development, but we always need to keep in mind this V model.
Right, absolutely. And I think the part where you said that right from the point of user needs, we are going to have to start documenting how the design controls are being implemented. So, talking specifically about SAMDs, I think user needs, of course, are going to be related to the achievement of a diagnostic or therapeutic purpose. That's what kickstarts the development of any kind of medical device. But when I think about how that's going to translate into design input and design outputs, but specifically design inputs, I think that might be getting a lot more technical than we are used to, because here everything is going to be in terms of the changes to an algorithm. So I think cross-functional collaboration, of course, is very important. But what's more important is that somebody who has a clinical perspective in terms of the user needs and what is required from the final software should be able to translate it or explain it to somebody who's coming from a computer science and the digital kind of things, that kind of background. And that understanding needs to be very well established in a team, right?
Yes, and I would also suggest that following the standard approach that is provided by the FDA framework or by the 13485, it's good to split the the design phases in blocks where you can work on different aspects of the device and have design reviews that are periodic or that are basically closing each development phase. And at these reviews, you need to involve cross-functional team members that can give, basically, they can validate the content of what was done during that development effort, and also bring input that can be important for the product ultimately.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes, I think that makes a lot of sense. And you spoke about the standard also, the IEC 62304. I think that was also one of the questions that we'll be discussing a little bit more in detail. So we can move on to that then. Yes, right here. So we know the standards such as what we just discussed, the IEC 62304, classify software based on risk. However, when we talk about SaMD, does it differ, and how do we go about classifying the product in this case?
Yes, this is another, I would say, classical question on this. So whether we do classify software as a medical device differently than physical devices, and the answer is no. Well, actually, the answer is a bit more complex as usual. It depends a lot on where in the world we are submitting our dossier. So we need to look into the regulation in that world part. Now, let's discuss the two main aspects and for FDA and for Europe. I think the most interesting field right now is the European field, because that has changed a lot. There's a new regulation coming, and this had a large impact on the way we bring this software into the market. So there is a high level. We can always split the discussion on a high level classification of the device as a device that considers really the high level description of what the device does towards a patient, and then a lower level design control discussion about what needs to be implemented depending on how risky a device is, or a portion, a part, a component of that device, a software item of that device is. So remember, there is the regulation, for example, in Europe, that describes what is needed by manufacturers so that they can bring the device into the market. And then there is a lower level standard that is applied to demonstrate, or actually to guide the development of the design controls, or to document the design controls. That is the 62304. So in the text of the 62304, that is a harmonized standard that is recognized by Europe, by the FDA, by Canada, Japan, and so on. It is written that the software must be classified in 3 categories of risk, A, B, C, depending on the risk of each part of the device, basically. So we can split the device into risk elements. But the ultimate goal of this is to, first of all, keep having a risk-based approach also for the development, and also ensure that the device that is being developed will be safe. Remember that according to the 62304, testing activities alone are not sufficient to demonstrate safety. So if I just test the device, and I know it can sound counterintuitive, but testing the device as such is not sufficient. That would be the case for a mechanical object that you just test extensively and you would say it's safe. But software, that's not the case, because software is more complex, it's prone to changes, it's prone to having many hidden problems. It's often depending on external elements. So what is most common is that we have a classification of a device that is depending on the intended use of the device. That determines the classification of the device as a whole. In Europe, we have class 1, 2A, 2B, and 3. Even class 1 now with the medical device regulation is split into different subclasses, where one is the measuring function. That could be interesting to a certain extent, also for software. FDA has 3 classes, and then we go on with having this general approach of classifying devices depending on the risk given their intended target population and their intended use. The software classification is more directly linked to the implementation of it. So what can happen if that module of the device goes wrong? So that's a different approach. I would say it's a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach. They need to converge anyway.
Right, right, absolutely. In fact, you just spoke about what doubt I had in my mind, that I understand that risk-based classification is going to focus on the intended use and the target population. But I was just thinking that even if my manufacturer, suppose, is claiming a seemingly low risk intended use, but the software for it is so complex that it's more prone to break down, then if something goes wrong, then it could lead to some bigger issues. So how are we going to think about that? And I think you already mentioned that these approaches need to sort of converge, where you're making sure that you're thinking about it from all aspects, and it's not just going to be a pure intended use, intended target population perspective, but you're also going to be thinking about what any sort of failure of that software, what kind of risk can that bring about. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. That's right. And also the use we do of these classification blocks is different. We do use classification of medical devices as such to interact with authorities and to know what they will need from us as manufacturers. We use the classification of the software to drive the development of the documentation that needs to establish that the device is safe and effective. So let's say that the use is different and different teams may use it, while a regulator, so if we're talking about corporate, for example, we may have a pure regulatory team dealing with the classification of medical devices as such, and we may have a pure development team working on the 62304 classific classes and risk development. So that could also a bit change depending on who's the group that's looking at the classification for what reason.
Right, absolutely. Very interesting perspective. Thank you for bringing that, Andrea.
You're welcome.
Okay, moving on to something more current, more relevant right now. We're seeing a lot of AI algorithms and this complete digitization of technology on the medical front as well. When we talk about AI-based algorithms that are changing on the basis of feedback, and these are auto-learning principles, and the self-training mode of these algorithms, how are we going to manage design changes for this? Because this becomes very, for lack of a better word, it becomes quite subjective in terms of the algorithm itself. So I think the tricky part is to think about design changes here. What do you have to say for that?
Yeah, that's for me. This is the most exciting aspect of the regulatory world right now. And I mean, the fact itself that I find something exciting in the regulatory world is already an achievement, I think. So AI and machine learning, I mean, they are hyped topics, but they are getting more and more common in our daily life. I mean, you can imagine what your mobile phone can do. Most of the more of the fantastic features, such as the voice recognition, are based on machine learning. This is a topic that I know very well because as I told you before, I did a PhD in it was basically machine learning. I was decoding brain patterns from electroencephalography, and I remember at the university at that time we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to answer this question that you put right here. So we had a system. So to make it simple, what is machine learning? Machine learning is the art or the science, still more an art than a science, of teaching a device how to decode information or how to make judgments based on a pre-existing sample of ensemble of observations. So we are teaching a device how to make a choice, basically. There are different techniques. There are many complex ways to validate that this is well done. And machine learning uses software. It is software, but the regulation is very ambiguous when it comes to how do we describe that type of software. Because you can imagine that I have an infrastructure that allows me to gather data and make a decision, so that I have the graphical user interface and all the services that are needed to give input and receive the output. And then there is a small module that is the machine learning module that, given an existing training set, is making decisions on the new samples that were never observed. Now, the 62304, for example, tells us how do we develop software so that we are sure that the software is correctly implemented and that the device is doing what the user wants. Good. But no one is telling us how do we train a machine in the correct way. And the field of machine learning itself, call it benchmarking, has been discussing for decades now how to validate that a model is better than another, that a system is the classifier is performing well. So these questions now are very new. It is entirely put on the shoulders of the manufacturer to have a strategy and to implement an approach to demonstrate safety and performance, especially if the classifier is changing across time. And that's what we call it auto learning or adaptive classification, is when you can imagine you train at day zero a machine that can decode if I'm imaging right hand movements or left hand movements. That's very well done for decades now in the field of brain computer interfaces. But then after 1 week, my waveforms may have changed, so we need to adapt the classifier and shift it. This adaptation is not taken into consideration in this world, and this problem is extended also to any diagnostic approach. When you have a diagnostic, you want to deliver a diagnosis of cancer, for example, looking at images, we may have the sample, the ensemble of sets that we train the machine on changing across time because we get more patients and we store more data, and more clinicians are giving us the labels so that we can tell them, this is how a cancer looks like, this is how a healthy breast looks like. So this is a very common problem. And right now, there's no regulatory framework that can accommodate that. There are a number of articles on Lancet Digital Health also on this topic. I think we need creativity at this time. We need collaboration with the academia. And we need good processes that can adapt and show that what we do makes sense. So we shouldn't wait for a standard to tell us what to do. We should be the standard somehow. And we should try to develop deep know-how that we can discuss with any peer. So I think that this approach of having peer reviews in what we do, or having discussion with peers that are technical experts, and we need to become technical experts when we want to commercialize an app that does something to the health of people, it's the way forward.
Right. I think I'm so impressed with what you just said about how we shouldn't wait for a standard, but we should be the standard somehow. And that sort of sums up the whole approach from regulatory concerns that we have in medical devices, because everything keeps changing. Like every day, there are new guidance documents coming out. And after a while, manufacturers need to realize that, like you said, we need to get creative with the way in which we are presenting our product. And that way, we are going to be able to dictate the course of its regulatory requirements during the marketing stage and also pre marketing. So that was one hell of a line, Andrea. I'm so happy I got to hear that. Thank you.
You're welcome. You see that we can get some exciting things in regulatory.
Yes, absolutely. This all sounds really exciting, especially like we're talking about AI algorithms, and you talked about how the waveforms may change over the course of a few days, and that got me thinking that when we are talking about design controls for this, especially at the verification and validation stage, I think it becomes very important to have accuracy and precision test as a part of the overall testing that is being done, because a precision becomes really important for any kind of software to make sure that we are getting repeatable results over the entire course of this use.
Yeah, and even more, I think it's important that every company has a test data set that can eventually become even public, so that they can try to demonstrate the efficacy of their classifier in a transparent way with respect to the community, and the community can test other approaches to demonstrate that that's correct. I think that, in my opinion, this is where it will go. It will go towards having data sets. Maybe regulatory agencies may have data sets that they can use to test the efficacy of different approaches, because otherwise it's just wild claims with very hard to demonstrate, and we need to move away from that.
Right, absolutely. I agree with that. Okay, and I think we're slowly converging towards the point that we keep discussing. The next question seems to be related to that. So, when we talk about usability in case of software as medical devices, what are the considerations for it? Because there is a software that is developed by these expert developers, and then we are trying to give that to the end users. So, what are we looking at when we talk about usability of these software?
Yeah, usability itself is a term that is quite inflated because we use it in different contexts, and often during development we give it a different meaning than in what we mean in the regulatory world. So I think on this regard, software as a medical device is a medical device, meaning that the same principle we would apply to any medical device apply to the software. And there are standards that we can follow that can give us some guidance on what to do. In the end, we should, I mean, it is a while already that we are looking at processes in a very integrated way. And I think all the changes in regulation are going in this direction. So we need to see usability linked to the risk management, linked to the clinical evaluation of this device. So in this case, I would say that early in the development life cycle, at the time where we start to draft the user requirements, we can establish also the risk management plan and maybe the initial design risk assessment or some initial use risk assessment. At this point, there will be a team looking at the potential risks related to how the device is used or how the device is made. And at that point, we should finalize, or we should find mitigation actions that can demonstrate that we are considering that risk, we are mitigating that risk as much as possible, and that's where a usability study can be very helpful. So usability study can give us information about how a potential intended user wants to use the device or handles the device or handles instructions of the device, but it can also give us data that we can use in support of demonstrating that a certain risk was mitigated. And that's the good practice. So we need to reason in terms of how can I show that this device can be used as I intend? Because I'm the manufacturer, I'm claiming that this device does something. I need to make sure that my users will be able to do that. And this becomes especially important when we develop medical apps, objects that would be on mobile phones of laymen used at home. In that case, we need to reason almost like we would reason in a clinical investigation. So it's a rigorous way of dividing claims and data needed to support claims, because this may actually sometimes save the situation when we have clinical evaluation issues where we need to establish that a certain feature is well backed up by data.
Okay, absolutely. And I'm thinking that when we are talking about software, perhaps like user-made errors, are quite common because I'm trying to think of it. Like if there is a person who's using a software to probably segment tumors or to perform this margin of a tumor, drawing the margin around a tumor, semi-automatically segmentation of a tumor or any such thing. And any inadvertent click or probably some sort of subjectivity, probably that might lead to some erroneous results. So for that also usability testing needs to take into account all of these considerations as well, right?
Yes and no. I mean, I think this example would be more, in my opinion, would be more something that would be handled. So all of it, usability studies and clinical evaluation, they are part of the validation of this software, okay? So we need to validate certain of the user requirements through some studies or some tests. So usability and clinical evaluation. Now, if the question is about the clinical performance, how well people can perform given the, let's say, their knowledge, it goes in clinical evaluation. If it's given the interface, it goes in usability. So your example actually is correct, because we can think that a user may not be able to detect a cancer because the user interface is so bad that they can't do it. But we can also imagine that this is due to the actual difficulty of that field, and that will come out from the clinical evaluation. So you see that it really depends on the case, and I think we need to stick to the standard that is there for the 62366 for the usability. That can be very good guidance, and I think it's also good to ask for feedback on these topics. There are companies that specialize, consulting that specialize in usability studies and usability design, so that we can get early on good feedback that can, it's very inexpensive at the beginning, can be very expensive down the path.
Excellent. Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. All right. Okay. Another very, very fancy topic of robotic surgery. So, in robotic surgeries, especially now, we're seeing that, or rather, for some time now, we've seen that there are robotic surgery devices which are basically based on programming a machine to perform surgical procedures. And like even a machine performing sutures on human tissue, I think that itself is commendable. So I'm thinking that these software, of course, are super complex, and I imagine that they are going to be the highest risk classification. What kind of consideration, any special considerations or controls are in place for such software that are related to robotic surgeries of the highest risk?
Yeah. So first of all, I would like to be a bit provocative and challenge this. It's not necessarily the highest risk. It depends how you make your intended use statement, because you can think of the most complex robotic devices, the Da Vinci, for example, which is a mastodontic piece that you install, and it's great for doing certain things, not so great for doing other things. I mean, it depends on the indication. In any case, you always have a human controlling this object for achieving an intended purpose. So it's, if you want, it's an instrument, it's an add-on. Now, if we talk about a fully intelligent robot that makes sutures, I'm not aware as of today. Maybe you can tell me about this, but because I'm not updated on this for a while. But until 2014, I'm sure that there was no robot that was fully autonomous performing surgeries on human that was cleared for sales, and I suspect it's still the case. And there was a study in Nature a few years ago showing soft tissue suturing of a bladder done automatically. So the surgeon would just say suture from here to here, and the robot would do this. Any surgeon that's listening to us will be very happy about this, because the suturing a bladder is very tedious. It's soft tissue. It's hard to suture well. So, and the robot would do it actually. So it could follow this trajectory and make the suture. There are no special considerations. So even if we are in that case of extreme, let's say, complexity, there are no special consideration. Now, I do think that in case of autonomous items and agents, the special consideration is how we demonstrate that they can perform well when there is a problem coming. And as of today, the answer to this is there's no way. You need to have a human that can intervene. So the only approach to mitigate that risk is to have a human there. So I don't believe we will see fully autonomous, unmanned procedures in the close future. But if anyone has such an approach that can demonstrate with clinical data this, I would be more than interested to know how it can be done.
Yes, absolutely. I think, like you said, that most of these are going to have some sort of human intervention. But that also, I feel, then it makes it semi-automatic, basically, that the human is controlling some data points, but the actual procedure is being done by the robot. And that itself, I think, is like leaps and bounds ahead of the kind of medicine that we were seeing a decade ago. So, even for that, I would think, like, I'm not really sure if it was right to say that these could be highest risk, but then to a layman like me, to actually think about it, that a device could be controlled to perform sutures, I think that itself says that if the software, like we were talking about, any one module breaking down, so if something like that happens for a device like this, then it could lead to some major complications in the patient, which is why I thought that this would classify as a high risk. But again, like we discussed, that intended use will come into the picture, and the overall medical purpose of it will also figure. So I see what you're saying and where you're coming from.
Yes, thank you. And I think also that, just to close on this topic, there is a concept called in robotics which is the shared control. And the shared control is when human and machines interact together for a common purpose. So you can imagine that you have an autonomous agent that could do things on their own, but they're actually waiting for a decision from the humans to execute a small portion. And I believe this will be the next step for robotic surgery. We will have semi-autonomous agents that wait for critical decisions from humans, or that may give back the control to the humans.
Okay, right. And I think that's always good because as much as I am a believer in the concept of AI taking over most of our aspects of medicine, I still feel that human intervention cannot be replaced completely. So I think this makes a lot of sense that there is always going to be some sense of control that the humans will have. But that also makes me wonder, and maybe I'm going a little bit off topic, but it makes me wonder then, what are the advantages of having these kinds of robotic surgery procedures when humans are the ones who are controlling? And I believe that the whole feel of a tissue, feeling the tissue in your hand, you are going to be able to understand what kind of suturing is required for it. So that can never be replaced. So I'm trying to think from that perspective that how are robotic surgeries replacing or rather even filling in for actual surgical procedures done by humans?
Well, there are a few answers. There are, let's say, is in general robotic surgery better than standard surgery? The answer is no. It's not in general better. Depends on indication. For certain indications, it is much better because you can access with a way less invasive approach the area. For some others, I mean, not being able to use your hands inside the patient could be a detriment. Now, I know that many manufacturers are trying to even provide, for example, haptic feedback on what is the tissue inside. So you can have haptic feedback on the robot itself, which can improve, of course, the accuracy of the procedure. But I think the most appealing reason for this is that you can have a very specific surgery to do somewhere, eventually even remote, and you could have someone controlling the robot from afar. There was a proof of concept not long ago using the 5G hyperspeed, let's say, connection, where a surgeon in a part of the world was controlling a robot doing a surgery in another part of the world, which is fantastic. I think that's a bit of the future that could happen. You have a local team that can stabilize the patient, but you have a surgeon that is remotely operating. That's very appealing.
Wow, that's very, very cool. Absolutely. I mean, yeah, what you said about remote control of the device and performing surgeries or being in a completely different part of the world, that is fascinating. And it will be great once this comes into the mainstream medical practice.
Yeah.
All right. I didn't even realize when we came to the last part of the discussion, and it was so interesting. I think talking about how we started off with just general software, and then we got into the whole AI part of it, and we ended on a lovely note with robotic surgeries and trying to understand how they figure in the entire medical landscape. And this was a very, very interesting discussion. Any final words from you, Andrea?
No, thank you very much for having me here. It was a very interesting debate. I also thank all the people that posted these questions. I think you did a very good job. These are the questions that we get also from real world clients. And yeah, looking forward for the next discussions.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Andrea. It was lovely having you here. And I'm so excited to see what the future holds for the medical community and also for patients. And it's very clear that things are going to be very interesting, and we're going to see a lot more of software involvement in the overall medical and clinical practices. Thank you for bringing that to the fore today with your discussion.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right, guys, thank you so much for being a part of this session. And that's all that we have for today. I'll see you next time with another topic on Tea Time Talks with MDRP. This is Anushri signing off on this episode. Bye bye.